In March 1982, international media coverage snapped into a sharp, narrow focus, a war-torn nation supposedly transforming into a democracy through a historic election. The footage broadcasted to the American public centered on long, orderly queues of Salvadoran voters. U.S. officials pointed to these lines as undeniable evidence of a free society emerging from the chaos of civil war. This imagery relied on the cropped frame, a deliberate narrowing of the lens that captured the act of voting while excluding the environment of state-sponsored terror. This was a demonstration election. The event functioned as a staged political performance for the United States Congress, designed to validate continued military aid by providing a televised picture of democratic progress. By evaluating a conflict through the visible ritual of the ballot box, the media can effectively rebrand a repressive military state as a triumph of the popular will. Understanding the violence that the cameras ignored requires looking at the deep historical structure of El Salvador. For a century, the nation's land and wealth were monopolized by an oligarchy known as the 14 Families. They established a coffee republic, an export economy built by dispossessing indigenous and peasant populations of their communal lands. These communities were pushed to the margins, forced into a cycle of cheap, seasonal labor on the plantations of the elite. When coffee prices collapsed during the Great Depression, the resulting rural desperation sparked a popular uprising in 1932. The military government responded with La Matanza, the slaughter, executing tens of thousands of indigenous peasants in a single week. The scale of the 1932 massacre effectively eradicated outward indigenous identity and normalized military dictatorship as the primary instrument of social control. The suppression of the 1932 revolt demonstrated that systemic, overwhelming violence was a functional and effective tool for preserving the economic status quo against civilian grievances. In 1972, reformist movements attempted to use the electoral process to break this cycle. José Napoleón Duarte, leading a coalition for land reform, appeared to win the presidential election by a clear margin. The military immediately suspended the tally and declared their own candidate the winner. They arrested and tortured Duarte, ultimately forcing him into exile and preserving their long hold on power through blatant fraud. The events of 1972 signaled that the institutional path to change was blocked. For many Salvadorans, the rigged election proved that the ballot box was no longer a viable alternative to the state's violence. This closure of the democratic road led directly to the formation of the FMLN. Dispossessed citizens concluded that since the military would not honor a vote, armed insurgency was the only remaining path to survival. When U.S. media described the 1982 election as a chance to save democracy, it ignored the fact that the Salvadoran state had already dismantled the democratic process 10 years earlier. Geopolitical tension peaked in 1979 when the Sandinista Revolution overthrew the dictatorship in neighboring Nicaragua, triggering an immediate shift in U.S. foreign policy. The Reagan administration moved to aggressively fund the Salvadoran military junta to prevent a similar revolution. However, maintaining this support required a narrative that was palatable to the American public and Congress. In February 1981, the State Department released a white paper titled Communist Interference in El Salvador, presenting a detailed inventory of weapons and logistical support. The document framed the conflict as a textbook case of indirect armed aggression by the Soviet Union and Cuba. By diagnosing the war as a foreign invasion, the report erased the internal history of land theft and oligarchic rule. This Cold War framing provided a functional alibi. It transformed a domestic class struggle into a global battleground, justifying the arming of a regime that was actively killing its own citizens. Before the 1982 election could be presented as a democratic triumph, the regime first had to physically liquidate the domestic political opposition. In 1980, Archbishop Óscar Romero issued a public plea to the U.S. to stop funding the Salvadoran military. One day later, he was assassinated by a right-wing death squad while celebrating Mass. The terror expanded to include international humanitarian workers. In December, the Salvadoran National Guard abducted, raped, and murdered 4 American churchwomen who were working with refugees in the countryside. The state's violence culminated at El Mozote, where the U.S.-trained Atlacatal Battalion executed nearly 1,000 civilians. Despite forensic evidence, the Reagan administration spent months aggressively denying the massacre occurred. The focus on the mechanics of Election Day ignored a fundamental reality. The basic core conditions of a free society, safety, assembly, and the right to criticize the state, had been systematically destroyed. Returning to the imagery of 1982, journalists continued to present the high turnout as a popular rejection of the guerrilla insurgency. But under a perpetual state of siege, voting was not a voluntary exercise. It was a mandatory act of survival enforced by the same military that stood guard at the polls. Citizens were legally required to have their national ID cards stamped of the polling station as proof that they had participated in the election. This created a lethal consequence for dissent. If a citizen was stopped at a military checkpoint and their ID card lacked the stamp, they were immediately classified as a subversive, making them a target for the death squads. Herman and Chomsky's analysis reveals how consent was manufactured. The press accepted the presence of ballots as proof of freedom, while ignoring the apparatus of terror that compelled the population to cast them. In El Salvador, the cameras captured the ballots, while the state-sponsored fear remained cropped out of the frame.